Russians are brought up with the idea that the Tsar, the father Tsar, is good and kind. And if any troubles happen, it's others who are to blame. The Boyars, it means not the Tsar, are the ones who should go to the chopping block. This happens every time the Tsar has problems. They throw the boyar under the bus. Moreover, the more complicated the problem, the higher the rank, so to speak, of the person who must be blamed and punished. How big must the problem be for Lavrov, who has served Putin faithfully and loyally, to be put under the axe? It's been 21 years already, I think, yes. So, Shoigu was removed from the axe so they wouldn't have to throw him under the bus. I don't know why exactly he couldn't be thrown under the bus, but they set up another minister instead. So if anything happens, he'll be the one to take the blame. So the intelligence chiefs will be thrown under the bus or train, I'm not sure. No one truly understands the purpose of foreign policy. So that means the Minister of Strange Affairs took off and arrived. So what huge thing actually happened? What? It had to be someone so close to Putin to bring out as a candidate. So what's it called? Scapegoat in English, and in Russian, I guess it's something like a ram or a sacrificial goat. All right, what happened was natural. So it's the 4th year of the war, and there's no victory over an opponent who was initially much weaker. There's no victory either on the front lines or in international relations, in the international community. Europe has already announced that it will stop buying Russian hydrocarbons. India and China have already reduced their purchases, and it looks like they will reduce them even more. 3/4 of the secretly purchased oil tanker fleet under sanctions have been discovered, and it can't get, well, let's say cargo insurance, without which it's incredibly dangerous to go out into the ocean. It can't enter ports for repairs if needed. It can't enter the waters of most countries. It has to operate in international neutral waters. Putin, flew to Alaska, flew to Alaska. And, well, the strategy of delays was clearly the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The princess brought sanctions against Lukoil, Rosneft, and Gazprom were already there. And then the meeting that Putin was hoping for in Budapest was canceled by Trump. The country doesn't have enough money for social programs, to keep the people calm. I don't think Putin really cares about the well-being of the people, but he definitely thinks about keeping them calm. Coffins keep coming in a steady stream from Ukraine, and Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa couldn't shake the dollar. The China-India alliance is mostly symbolic, serving to play both sides. China could easily drop Russia anytime to make peace with the United States, leaving Russia isolated. Someone has to be to blame for this. And of course, it can't be the Tsar. He's a demigod, Vladimir Vladimirovich himself.
Putin is in a complete state of panic, and his paranoia has just claimed its biggest victim yet. The crisis began with a simple, unsuccessful phone call. Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, who has served alongside Putin for 21 years, is now the latest victim of the Kremlin's downfall. Lavrov is now the official scapegoat for the collapse of the Russian economy and the failure of the planned Trump-Putin summit. The lie is simple. Russia is failing not because of Putin, but because of corrupt politicians who are sabotaging his orders. Now, the question for every Russian official is clear. Who's next in line? Who's next in line?
Chopping block. The Tsar is good. The Boyars are bad.
It all started with a list of demands that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov sent to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The Financial Times reported these demands came a day after President Trump and Putin agreed by phone to meet in Budapest. The purpose of this meeting was supposed to be to discuss how to end the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the phone, Putin made it clear that he was ready to discuss how to achieve peace if the United States would not supply Tomahawks to Ukraine.
I don't know how accurate this information is, but let's say we believe it. At least in order to understand the potential dismissal of Lavrov. I warn you right away that despite the outward resemblance and being born almost at the same time, Lavrov and I are not related. And we're definitely not identical twins. No, Lavrov is not my brother, brother-in-law, relative, or sister, as I've been asked several times. By the way, if you want to get more quality content, hit the bell, and the content will definitely come to you like clockwork. Because people write to me saying that I suddenly disappear for 2 or 3 weeks, I usually do 2 episodes a day, with one of them on Sunday morning, and that's live, while the rest are scheduled for a specific time. Sunday at 10 a.m. Los Angeles time, there's a live broadcast about Elik with questions and possible answers. So, having established that Lavrov and I are not the same person and not even clones, let's move on to the corridors of Kremlin power. Putin says to Trump on the phone, "Let's resolve the issue of suspending the shipment of the latest weapons to Ukraine and discuss the terms for ending the war." So she noticed it, says Trump. Well, maybe not in those exact words, but that's the idea. Let's meet in Hungary and, as they say, have a talk. After that, Lavrov sends a note asking, "What are we going to talk about?" In which everything that Russia had been demanding from Ukraine since 2012 is listed. Before that, during their meeting, he basically laid all this out to him. Rubio was a bit stunned and asked to have it sent to him in writing. They sent it to him, and when Trump saw all of it, he said again, "I'm not going to wait any longer." And then sanctions were imposed on oil companies, pressure was put on buyers, and Turkey refused Russian oil products. Ukraine began preparing to receive Tomahawks. By the time Ukrainian soldiers began training to work with them,
But a few days later, the Russian foreign minister sent a memorandum emphasizing the same demands that Putin has been making for 3.5 years. These demands included territorial concessions, a significant reduction of the Ukrainian armed forces, and guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO. For the United States, this was not a discussion. It was a waste of time, because what Russia is asking for is not peace. It's a request for Ukraine's surrender. That's when the United States announced unprecedented sanctions. They completely blocked the sale of oil from the 2 largest Russian oil companies, and now Russian exports are in decline. That's not me saying it, that's United States intelligence. Listen.
I wanted to know if you have any updates regarding the sanctions on Russian oil. We see reports that exports have dropped significantly. How might this impact the war in Ukraine and the interests of the United States and your partners here tonight? Thank you.
Exports from Russia have dropped sharply. We would just like to see an end to the war. We would really like to see an end to this war. So many people are dying, so many Russian soldiers are dying. So we think that at some point they will get very smart and do it in such a way that, yes, Russian exports have dropped significantly.
We can see that the Russian economy is already struggling. And the funniest thing is that the sanctions officially come into effect only on November 22. That's because the United States announced the sanctions on October 22 and gave every company in the world 1 month to cut all business ties with the companies that were sanctioned. Well, just a few weeks after the sanctions were announced, business ties had already been cut, and Putin knew this would happen. That's why just a few days after the United States announced the sanctions, Kremlin television began broadcasting a mysterious message. I discussed this 12 days ago. Listen to what Kremlin television said.
We actually have a weak state.
What? On the main zombie channel of Russia, in the show of Russia's main zombie expert, it was stated that Russia is a weak state. And Solovyov didn't stop it, didn't drop the curtain, didn't turn off the broadcast. Well, maybe he knew they would say that. Maybe someone hinted to him. Or maybe he was ordered to. Maybe Putin's people want to get something across to the population.
In reality, our state is weak. It's weak. It was created to be weak. It was created in the 90s in such a way that some oligarch or some person could influence how the state would continue to function. Naturally, this weak state now needs to be strengthened somehow. There's no need to wait for the war to end. That is,
we need to tighten the screws, if I understood correctly what was said. It seems someone besides the Tsar father is responsible for our troubles. But who?
There's no need to wait for now. It's not a weak state, but a weak structure. That's its very architecture.
Or
Presidential power is strong.
That's what I was getting at.
Yes, it's clear.
what we're talking about,
The state on which this power, this structure, this foundation stands is weak when a huge number of presidential decrees are ignored because it's easier for officials to do nothing, knowing the consequences of inaction, like with the oil refineries and so on.
Yeah, strong presidential rule, but the ways someone back then, like in the 90s, not Putin, of course. He was still in St. Petersburg, not Moscow. At that time, they created a structure. They gave too much independence to officials, to the executors. Basically, they gave too much freedom to those bastards.
But they got lazy and started selling out the motherland. The state can't do anything because it doesn't have a mechanism to make those officials do anything.
there's no mechanism to just take and force that official. It's even scarier there. It's
Even scarier. In the 90s, we built it in such a way that gaps of irresponsibility formed, where there's simply no one responsible. We still think that ministries manage the sectors they're named after, but that's far from reality.
the areas whose names they bear, but in reality, it's not even close.
Now it's the classic Russian tactic of the good Tsar and bad Boyar.
What I'm saying is the Tsar is good, but there are some bad uncles and aunts. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Sobchak, maybe even, God forbid. So does that mean everything is arranged so that the Tsar's orders aren't carried out? Can you imagine they tripped him up like that? And because of that, because they did such a bad thing, you have to suffer for it. 2 weeks ago, the channel Business Basics made the following prediction.
Russian politicians better stay alert, because Kremlin television gets its talking points directly from the Kremlin. Right now, Putin is just blaming politicians. Soon, he will start punishing everyone for his own failures. You see, the situation in Russia is getting so bad that even state propaganda can't avoid it. That's why they have to talk about it, since it's everywhere. That means they'll have to throw someone to the wolves for the public. It won't be Putin. I don't want to give ideas to Russian politicians, but all I'm saying is if they watched my channel, Lavrov would know what's waiting for him. We received this report yesterday. The Kremlin is seeking someone to blame after the failed Putin-Trump talks. Russian insiders say responsibility has been assigned to Foreign Minister Lavrov. Now he is the main scapegoat. Ironically, Lavrov was actually trying to impress Putin by taking a tough winning stance in negotiations with the United States, but he overestimated his abilities. He came unprepared, refused to discuss compromise, and firmly repeated Putin's instructions on Ukraine. Well, now even Russian media are wondering why he doesn't appear at all official meetings. Just recently, he was absent from a major Security Council meeting where Putin was making nuclear threats. The reason why this is so significant is that he was the only permanent member who wasn't present at that meeting. Now, as if that wasn't enough. It seems that he was also removed from his position as the head of the delegation that will go to the G20 summit. Now, you see, since the beginning of this invasion, Putin hasn't left the country often. This means that for the past 3 years, Lavrov has led the Russian delegation at the G20, which makes sense since he's the foreign minister. But it appears his name was removed at the last moment. Now, if you're interested in my personal opinion on this matter, I honestly think it's a good decision. Russia isn't sending Lavrov, since here's what happened the last time he attended the G20.
You know, this is a war we're trying to stop, and which was unleashed against us using Ukraine.
Lavrov's removal was a big shock for everyone, both inside Russia and abroad. That's because his position on the war isn't much different from what Putin has been saying all these years. But even then, when things are going badly, Lavrov ends up under fire for saying the same things as Putin.
It's a common story. Someone said exactly what the leader said, but it didn't work. So that the leader isn't blamed, they cut off the head of the one who zealously repeated the foolishness. Well, like what Lavrov said means that Ukraine, supported by the West, attacked Russia. And since then, we've been constantly trying to stop the war. Well, of course, the audience burst out laughing. It was an audience in the West, as you understand.
But that's what his boss said. I mean, Vovka Morkovka. Lavrov, I mean, he's been Russia's foreign minister, I think, since the birth of Jesus Christ. And since then, nothing useful has come out of his mouth. So let's not pay too much attention to Mr. Lavrov.
For Lavrov, this might come as a surprise. For many Russians who strongly supported the war, this is not new. That's because in Russia, over the past few months, and possibly throughout 2025, there's been a trend where Putin is arresting not only dissenters, but also many popular supporters of the war within the country. That's because rival factions within Russia are now turning against each other. And these two factions are veteran propagandists who are closely connected to the defense industry and the Kremlin. These people are known as loyalists. And the other faction, which is kind of a new faction, is all these ultra-nationalist war supporters who call themselves Z-bloggers. We often quote these Z-bloggers in our videos because they closely follow the war and provide the Russian perspective. But besides that, some of these Z-bloggers publicly criticize Putin for the way he is conducting this war. Here I want to clarify a bit. They are not criticizing Putin for starting this war, quite the opposite. In fact, they think that Putin is not acting tough enough in Ukraine. They want to wipe out Ukrainian nationality from the face of the earth and consider the Russian army a failure for not achieving this goal. Well, for Putin it doesn't matter whether the threat comes from dissenters or ultranationalists, because in the end, for him, it's not about anything specific, it's only about survival.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was accused of sabotage by Kremlin officials after his conversation with United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which disrupted a planned meeting between Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and United States President Donald Trump in Budapest. This was reported by the Russian Telegram channel Nezigar, citing sources. According to them, after the summit was cancelled, Putin had a serious conversation with Lavrov, and officials believe that the minister committed sabotage. Lavrov is clearly depressed right now. He found himself at the center of the intrigue, the channel quotes one of its sources as saying. According to the source, many are now convinced that Lavrov is following in the footsteps of Sergei Shoigu, who lost his position as head of the Russian Ministry of Defense in May of last year. The interlocutor adds that Lavrov has lost the favor of the head of the Kremlin and now appears to be the weak link. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the aggressor country is now forced to make public leaks to prove its innocence in the failure of the meeting between Putin and Trump. The channel writes that Lavrov, taking a tough stance in his conversation with Rubio, thought he was expressing Putin's position, but this allegedly turned out to be untrue. But Lavrov managed to discredit the Dmitriev-Vitkov communication channel in the eyes of Rubio and Trump, according to the report. The subsequent urgent visit of the Kremlin's special envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, to Washington was unsuccessful and did not help to fix the situation.
That is, there is suspicion that Lavrov sent his letter and said what he said to Rubio in order to prevent Dmitriev from taking his place, well, let's say his comfortable spot in negotiations with America.
Russian media report that after an unsuccessful conversation with United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which led to the cancellation of the planned Putin-Trump summit, Lavrov suddenly disappeared from all official events. Lavrov was absent from the meeting of the Russian Security Council, where Putin instructed to consider the issue of resuming nuclear tests. He was the only permanent member of the Security Council who was absent. The White House recently stated that Lavrov was clearly tired. Then the Kremlin dealt another blow. Lavrov was stripped of his position as head of the Russian delegation at the G20 summit. His place will be taken by the young economist Maxim Oreshkin. He's clearly closer to Putin's inner circle now. This decision by the Kremlin looks like a demonstrative surrender of the old warrior. Lavrov, who for a long time was a symbol of Putin's diplomacy, has become an inconvenient figure, too old, too predictable, and too closely associated with foreign policy failures.
In the eyes of Russians and probably the whole world, Lavrov personified Russian international diplomacy, of course. And since he and diplomacy have failed, it means that either he or Putin is to blame. And Putin, I guess, decided that it's better to hang Lavrov out to dry while he himself falls on the grenade. Lavrov is still officially the minister, and the Kremlin denies any disputes with Putin. But Lavrov's absence from all sorts of important meetings and other factors show that he is, at the very least, hanging by a thread. And what will happen to him if he doesn't persuade Putin? That means they'll put someone else in his place, set someone else up, and he'll get a cushy retirement somewhere in the Animal Protection Fund. Yeah, just oblivion. Maybe leave, go to his daughter Yekaterina in the United States, but most likely they won't let him. Well, Yekaterina actually works at Christie's. It's an art auction house, the so-called art auction house, and it operates in 3 cities, Moscow, London, and New York. By the way, she was born in New York. Lavrov's dismissal, if it happens, will not change the direction of Russia's foreign policy. They'll just change the face and maybe get rid of a couple of final foolish things. But most likely it will lead to a further tightening of policy and to a decrease in the role of diplomacy in favor of a more confrontational scenario toward the United States, Europe, NATO, and Ukraine. But in reality, it all comes down to China becoming almost the only country truly capable of influencing Putin's strategic decisions, such as the possible use of nuclear weapons or agreeing to a peace deal with the West. Remember, it's about the West, not just Ukraine. However, the interests of China and Russia do not always align. China is interested in prolonging the conflict, believing that it weakens, so to speak, Western countries, NATO, the alliance, America, and so on. But it clearly doesn't want Russian efforts, well, escalation, what's called escalation of war and instability. This could threaten peace on the entire planet, and accordingly, China's interests. Russia has found itself in the position of China's junior partner, forced to take strategic directives into account. That refers to the Celestial Empire, which drives them. It makes them, so to speak, dependent on how China conducts its policy toward the West. And unless Russia decides to switch over to the embrace of the United States, so to speak, China is and remains the biggest supplier to Russia. For example, critical electronics and components for drones. Any restriction on supplies from China is a blow to the Russian army and, accordingly, to the Russian military economy. China is deliberately rationing its assistance, just like Biden once deliberately rationed aid to Ukraine. And China is doing this in order to... Russia has neither lost nor won. Let's put it this way, yes, Biden did about the same thing with Ukraine so that it wouldn't lose or win. And the Chinese market is the main one for selling Russian energy resources, grain, metals, and fertilizers. Russia sells a huge amount of fertilizers all over the world. If China stops buying, it will be a disaster for the Russian economy. Lavrov's departure or disgrace is, of course, connected with all these events. Of course, Lavrov represented a certain policy approved by Putin naturally, yes. And now, when the policy needs to be changed, Putin is changing the face of this policy. Where is he changing it? What is he changing it to? We don't know yet. Either even more under China's heel or more drastic moves at the front, as the nationalists and the generals want, or a turn toward the United States. We, of course, don't know. And even appointing a new minister, well, if Lavrov really does get kicked out, won't really give us the full picture, because there isn't a single figure there who, let's say, says, does, or calls for anything that doesn't align with Putin's position. As of today, I'm not talking about that theoretical opposition, the one that ran abroad, actors, singers, athletes, and so on. But I think that by the beginning of 2026, well, in the first 2 or 3 months, we will understand where Putin is steering the ship with holes in the bottom, clearly with holes and no tires, and how the military actions in Ukraine are developing. That's all. Honestly, I'm not really concerned about Lavrov's fate. It's just amusing to watch how it's always the same. The familiar Tsar, the good Tsar, the kind Tsar, and the bad Boyars, someone is always to blame for his mistakes. How is this playing out right now? But still, nevertheless, we will see some changes soon, and by soon I mean again at the beginning of next year, 2026. So that's all, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for visiting the channel, and don't forget to hit the bell and subscribe. And if anyone wants to write off money from taxes, I mean Americans, yes, from $200 to $200 million, we can accept it through our nonprofit organization and help your financial matters or your company, your corporation. Goodbye, to be continued.